One of the silliest arguments I've seen in relation to this whole debate around China being neo-colonialist or imperialist in Africa is the argument of debt forgiveness.
Excited to have you once more, amazing viewer. I'm back again with another compilation. The conversation on whether China is imperialist and neo-colonialist towards African countries was buzzing on the internet. It has been a conversation that started slightly before the beautiful parade that we all enjoyed, and we are going to look into this compilation. It's going to be a bit lengthy. Like the video for recommendation. Before we dive into the speeches that were given in response to this, allow me to let you listen to the creator who started this conversation.
Hey, my name is CJ. I'm here to give a revisal of my original take and when it pertains to Chinese exploitation within the Congo. I can now see why people had so much trouble with the sources being used, but what you all need to understand is the sources and information that I'm using are still undeniable facts, and I'm actually just going to get it from the primary source in this video. I finally understood that you all don't care about the sources of information that are being used. You all rather care about if the sources of information, if they feed into you all's confirmation bias when it pertains to China. What do I mean by this? You all are liking and reposting a video by Maven who is a known groomer in P3DO and a known simper and larper for white nationalism. But you all are liking and reposting his video. It does not matter the source is Maven. You all are liking and reposting his video just because this feeds into you all's already existing confirmation bias when it pertains to China. Pause and read. So now that that's out the way, we can understand that this whole thing is rooted in what we call a genetic and ad hominem fallacies. This is what a genetic fallacy is for you all that don't know. Pause and read. So now that that's out the way, we can finally get into the historical context and why I came to the conclusion that China is indeed imperialist. What we have to understand about the Congo is that, yes, Congo has been largely dominated by Western powers and European powers, including the United States, since the 1400s. The system of colonial rule and colonial violence continues today and is the reason why we have the genocide going on in the Congo. What a lot of you all don't understand is China's complacency and China's dominance in the spheres of influence that it has within the DRC. Today, I'm going to be using a book called Cobalt to draw my conclusions and draw my data from. Please engage with it critically. What we see in the Congo is a system of colonial violence, exploitation, enslavement, child labor, human rights violations, and genocide. And there are multiple companies that are complicit with this. Apple, Samsung, Google, Huawei, which is a Chinese multinational conglomerate corporation, in which generates over $860 billion in revenue from these cobalt refineries. Pause and read. We can see that these foreign mining companies have major influence over the Congolese government and how the Congolese government runs. We need to detach the Congolese government first from the Congolese people. We can understand that even if China is giving loans to the DRC's government, this does not mean a net benefit for the people because this is still an exploitative and colonial system. And as we can see from Cobalt there is no such thing as a clean supply chain that is coming from the DRC. All of this cobalt and all of these other metals like tin and nickel are tainted by abuse, slavery, genocide, and other systems of horrific exploitation. That's just in one town in the DRC called Kelwezi. Now we can talk about 10K Fumarume, which is one of the largest operations of mining within the DRC, which 80% of this mine is owned by a Chinese multinational conglomerate called CMOC, which stands for Chinese Molybdenum Company Limited. The other 20% of the mine is owned by a Congolese national state enterprise called Geka Mines. So this is usually what happens within the DRC. A joint venture is instilled between a foreign mining company and a state national corporation. And what we see coming out of this is no net benefit for the Congolese proletarian or the people. But before I get too far ahead of myself, we need to talk about what the supply chain looks like within the DRC. It starts off with artisanal miners, which are usually owned by DRC nationals, individuals, or other Western expropriations. The artisanal miners are the enslaved people. This is at the bottom of the upstream. So the artisanal miners are the ones that are being unalived and the ones that are dying inside the mines within the Congo. From this either goes to a negotiator or a depot. 30% of the depots in the DRC are owned by Chinese multinational conglomerates. And then from this either goes to an industrial mine in which China owns 80% of the industrial mines within the Congo. And then after the industrial mine, it goes to a mineral refinery. And from the mineral refinery, it goes to either electric vehicle or your smartphone. Pause and read. We also see that a lot of the artisanal mining occurs on the industrial mining sites, which is again against DRC law, but it still happens. Again, the industrial mining sites are largely dominated by Chinese corporations, who then refine these things and then sell them to the major tech companies like Google, Apple, etc., etc. It's so bad that 75% of the refined cobalt that came out of the world in the year of 2021 came from China. We also see that a lot of these mining sites are protected and guarded by either the Congolese National Police, other paramilitary forces, or private contracted paramilitaries that are paid by the Chinese government. Pause and read. We also see a senior official at Geka Mines has also said that the reason why China is able to do this is because the DRC does not have the electrical capacity nor the infrastructure to effectively refine cobalt. This leads to a system of exploitation and extraction in which China is able to bring its own industry, maintain its own ownership within the industry, and not provide any type of infrastructure so the people of the DRC can refine this cobalt themselves. This is the inherent system of imperialism. This is capitalism. Anytime that you have a system of enslavement that is based on the backs of black enslaved people, this is capitalism. Anytime that you have a system that necessitates exploitation, this is capitalism. Anytime that capital leaves your foreign borders for a return investment on this expropriated capital, that is the imperialism. China is making profit off of these mines. This is an undeniable fact. Mining is also incredibly dangerous and terrible for the environment. China is benefiting and profiteering off a system of enslavement. And as I said before, it's not just China, it's America that's profiting off of this system, and it's other European nations. The whole world is profiting off of this system and this extraction site within the DRC. In that image I also shows, we also see in Hakatanga and the Lulababa provinces that China owns and finances 15 out of the 19 mining operations in those provinces alone. To finish off this video, I will show and deconstruct the whole talking point of, well, China does not have any type of influence over the DRC's government, which is just false. Historically, this is just ahistorical. What we have to understand is the DRC post-Patrice Lumumba, in which a lot of Western-backed governments were then implemented in his fall. The two most important characters in this story and in this part of the story are the Kabila father and son duo. Their names are Laurent Kabila and Joseph Kabila. The Kabila duo is a duo that needs to be talked about more in these conversations. Laurent was unalived by one of his bodyguards in the year of 2001. After this, his son Joseph took power. What Joseph did was opened up the DRC's mining sector to a lot of Chinese companies, and these Chinese companies filled his pockets. His pockets were filled through his connections to the BGFI bank, in which Chinese multinational corporations would just load his account with money. Now, the West got in his handpicked successor's ear, which is a politician by the name of Tedasheki. Tedasheki is backed by Western investors, while Kabila is backed by Chinese and Eastern investors. This has set the stage for an election in which saw Kabila largely getting backing from these Chinese corporations. Pause and read. And we can see that the psycho mines that Kabila opened within the DRC are actually connected to China Railway Group. Pause and read. So we can see that Chinese corporations, which are connected to the state because the state owns a lot of these enterprises, expropriate capital through industrial capital, which is in Chinese banks, to these places within the DRC, fill the pockets of the politicians so they can turn a blind eye to the exploitation that is occurring. And so Chinese multinational corporations can go off and laugh to the bank. So America and everybody in the whole world laughs off to the bank while the people within the Congo are suffering. No one, including China, America, or any other countries that are within the DRC, have done anything to uproot this colonial system of exploitation. This is the inherent problem. China cannot go into a colonial system with just better loans and expect that colonial system to be upended. Like Frantz Fanon once said, we should dig the tomb in which colonialism will forever be entombed. Socialists do not plug themselves in with their own capital and their own investments into already exploitative environments and just allow for this exploitation to continue. I know this was the longest video I ever made, and I'll probably make a part 2 to this video, but I believe that this video was ultimately needed because a lot of people don't even know about the history of the DRC and what's going on in the DRC.
But hey, regardless of whether you think he's totally off, it's whatever you think about it and the conversation. I'm gonna have to say it's a really good thing. Like, I really love that we are talking about this and this debate because it's something that isn't talked about. Most people now, people are researching, looking up different things about different countries in Africa, China's history, etc., looking for connections, looking to understand these concepts. And these are things that typically in the United States, we don't really think much about. So I think it's really great.
I got leftist mutuals citing Western-backed pro-empire propaganda. On the other hand, I have leftist mutuals who are sharing videos of a guy who is an alleged sex pest because he was refuting the claim. This is leftist infighting. So let's really talk about China's relationship to the global south. Before we get into it, no nation is above criticism. All nations have their shortcomings. Now let's address Congo. All the key perpetrators of the Congolese genocide, the Rwandan army, the Congolese military, the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, and the Allied Democratic Forces, all of them are funded by the US, the EU, and US-backed proxies like ISIS. China provides military and financial support to none of them. Building the infrastructure for a country to extract resources from their land is not colonialism, because the extraction of said minerals is not forced under the threat of violence. And like I said, China does not fund any military action in Congo. Meanwhile, the West, namely America, the UK, and Belgium, are financially, militarily, and tactically supporting all groups responsible for artisanal mining, funding all the groups responsible for the trafficking, the massacres, the illegal taxation, and overall control of the entire illicit minerals trade. Also, China's investment into the global south cannot be seen as debt trapping because they are more likely to forgive those infrastructure loans than not. Unlike the West, who's been holding on to colonial debts in Africa since the 1800s, China has waived infrastructure loans on the majority of African nations. 61%, more than half of African countries, have had infrastructure loans granted and waived by China. With that being said, is China doing this because they're some selfless savior nation? No. China looks to pull countries out of poverty and end their reliance on the Western colonial states because they are the global leader of production. And you cannot sell product to countries with no money. You cannot sell cars to countries who don't have paved roads. You can't sell machinery to countries that don't have industrial infrastructure. They are looking for a long-term investment that pays out in the back end. That's it. On the flip side, America and the West have always used violent extraction, destabilization, and warfare as a means of controlling trade. And that makes their relationship with the global south fundamentally different than China's. That's why America has over 750 military installations worldwide, and China has one. That's not even accounting for all the Western-backed puppet states like Rwanda, Israel, Ukraine, Egypt, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, El Salvador. That's why China is the primary financial and military backer of the anti-colonial movement seen in the AEL, or the Alliance of Sahel States. And that's why America's having press conferences on how they should invade those same nations. That's why China is providing military support to Burkina Faso, and America and the West have orchestrated double-digit assassination attempts against Ibrahim Traore in search of a violent regime change. China's trying to pull countries of the global south away from Western influence by providing them with trade agreements that have the potential to positively impact people in the global south. Trade agreements that are not being forcibly signed under the threat of economic sanctions, regime change, military action, and genocide. And note that I said these are trade agreements that have the potential to be beneficial to people in the global south. When we look at Congo, China has built the infrastructure to help the DRC nationalize their own resources. But because the national identity of the DRC has been so fragmented by Western imperialism dating back to King Leopold II, they are in a constant fight to fill the power vacuum left by that. And all groups perpetuating the direct violence are funded by the West, are funded by America, the UK, Belgium, and other Western-backed proxies like ISIS. Meanwhile, because the national identity of Burkina Faso has been so anti-colonial, because Western influence within their inner government has been largely neutralized, China's investments in their economic growth and infrastructure are lifting poor people out of poverty every single day. China's economic framework is built on mutual trade. Meanwhile, America and the West's economic framework is built on violent violent extraction. China wants to take your money by selling to you. America wants to take your money by robbing you. These are vastly different ways of growing your economy, but one is fundamentally better for the global South's push to modernize and increase the material conditions of their people. And a lot of the criticism I'm seeing of China fails to recognize the fact that China has been fighting anti-Western colonial advances for centuries, solely because they showed the world that a communist revolution can pull an entire population out of poverty. That's why the US government committed a genocide in Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, because they saw the influence of China's proximity to a lot of nations, causing them to adopt a proletariat first framework. And to wrap this up, in reference to China's relationship with Congo, the exploitation has been happening far before China ever came to Congo, and if China never went to Congo, the exploitation would still be happening. The only difference would be that America is now the one cornering the market for rare minerals, giving them another foot up militarily on the global stage, giving them more power to exploit everyone in the global South, giving them more power to economically strangle nations of the global South, preventing anything like Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger from happening. Everything is not black and white or good or evil. China has all kinds of shortcomings, but the way that they interact with the global South is fundamentally different than the West. The way that they've interacted with the global South and revolutionary movements historically has been better than the West. Historically has benefited poor people around the globe more than the West. Historically has not leaned on things like military action, violent extraction, and genocide as a means of boosting their economy. China is no one's savior, but China will provide nations with the tools needed to save themselves. In America, the West, they will never do that. They profit off of people being fucking poor. And China loses money from the globe being poor, because who the fuck they gonna push all that product to?
Now, I've done videos in the past of China. I'll try to tag them below. I've done videos on many countries that have been deemed foreign adversaries of the United States. That's Russia, Iran, Cuba, and Venezuela. And I do it from a Pan-Africanist or Marxist-Leninist perspective or framework because that is my political foundation. Nonetheless, the part I'm stitching of Khalil's video where you're talking about the force is quite literally required or necessity for the extraction to be imperial or neo-colonial. I remember I got a comment on my video when I was talking about like Uyghur separatists, and someone asking about African continent, and I was like, what the fuck is going on? But now I realize it's part of this larger conversation being had. Nonetheless, I shared this image I'm going to share right now. Countries in the continent of Africa that work with China, they are able to make demands of China for China to meet those demands without the threat, the worry that China will conduct a regime change in their country, that China will deny their sovereignty to put forward a puppet. They are able to understand and work with China knowing that they don't have the threat hanging over their head. However, when it comes to the United States or the former colonizer, France in particular, they do have that threat because that is how they work, because the threat of force is again required for that relationship to be neo-colonial, be imperialist. That force is needed. It is the denial of sovereignty. Not only that, what's really been grinding my gear is that people are using terms like imperialism or even, for example, neo-colonialism, and not even like citing or using the theory from the person who like gave us the understanding of neo-colonialism, which is Kwame Nkrumah, who was the first president of Ghana and also one of the co-founders of the All African People's Revolutionary Party, a scientific socialist party that was created in the continent of Africa, in Ghana, that still exists today, which are chapters around the world. African people of the diaspora are trying to build a Pan-Africanist world. One of the other co-founders is Kwame Turum, sorry I'm talking so fast, who many people know and cite because, of his foundational activism here in the United States. And so it's just very interesting that we're having this discussion, we're having this discourse, but like the literature, the theory of African socialists from the continent are just not being like cited or not being weighted. And it's just very unfortunate. But I do want to hit home again that the denial of sovereignty, the forced extraction is critical for the relationship to be defined as neo-colonial or imperial. Otherwise, it's just mutual trade agreements. And we cannot look at mutual trade agreements when a country needs the infrastructure, desperately needs the infrastructure for the development, be able to feed their citizens, as being neo-colonial when, again, there's no threat of force being used against them. To go a step further, let's say China offered some other country their BRI credit, and the country's like, no thanks, we don't want the BRI, but thanks, we appreciate it. China's like, okay, no problem, our relationship relationship still continues. And guess what? That country does not have the threat of China pulling a color revolution, pulling a regime change in order to seat a puppet who will accept that BRI, which does happen when it comes to IMF or World Bank loans, which does happen when it comes to the United States or some other European power not getting what they want. What they do is they have a color revolution or a regime change and seat a puppet who will accept their IMF or World Bank loans. The denial of sovereignty is quite needed, necessary for the relationship to be neo-colonial or imperialist. Even go in a further step. Let's say a Chinese citizen, they're part of the business that's there helping with a BRI, commits a crime in said country. Guess what? China's not going to intervene on that citizen's behalf to save them in that country. They allow that country to prosecute their Chinese citizens without, again, the regime change for the revolution or to protect them. The denial of sovereignty, the force is needed for that relationship to be neo-colonial imperialist, not simply just trade. Like, criticize the businesses that have their practices, which those countries are doing, which is why they're demanding China, handle them. But nonetheless, there's no denial of sovereignty.
The biggest thing that's weighing on my mind is the discourse around China being a quote unquote neo-colonial power, especially in Africa. Now, I just don't agree with it. I just do not agree with that. I feel like us as Black people, we have been so used and abused, that anything from the outside is gonna be met with a trauma response, collective mistrust, which, can you blame us? No. And then this is what the actual powers that be, the West want. They want you to be like, oh, look, the Chinese are actually trying to help them, but they think they're gonna, okay. And I'm like, just a lot of things that I see online on TikTok, I just be like, I don't agree with. Is China spreading its, or, consolidating its soft power? Duh. No shit. We're trying to, I've made plenty of videos about this shit. We are trying to move to the 21st. We are in the 21st century. We're trying to dismantle the systems of the fucking 20th century that have plagued this planet for fucking decades. Look what's going on in Indonesia. What's going on in fucking the Philippines. What's going on in Gaza, Sudan. None of those are communist countries, right? China is showing a fucking blueprint of all right, let's make this happen. Now, is China perfect? No. China's like a fucking human, like every other country. Mistakes will be made. It's about how do they correct these mistakes. When it comes to the water pollution in Zambia, now that's still developing, right? And I'm over here looking at China, my girl, and being like, look, I need you to do right. They telling me, we're going to do right. I'm like, I need you to do right. Okay? I can't have them talking shit about, look, my reputation is on the line. Your reputation is on the line. One thing I know about China, they don't like to fucking lose face. Mianzi is very important. And being seen as copying the West and just going in and subjugating and genociding and stealing and looting, they're like, that's not our style. We got more class than that. So when something like a major river in a country like Zambia is affected or polluted, I'm gonna need everybody to come on board and clean this shit up. I'm gonna need y'all to clean this shit up. And I'm going to need you. This is what I think they're going to do. I think they're going to clean this shit up. Because, China's no stranger to environmental degradation. They've environmental degraded themselves for a long time. And now they're like, we got to clean this up. And guess what they did? Cleaned it up. So they have the ability to clean it up. Clean that shit up. And don't let it happen again. Okay, because we can't have the Africans and the Chinese and the blacks. We can't be at fucking war. We gotta be here. Black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow, black and yellow. You know what it is. Because we need you, you need us. And in Chinese philosophy, harmony. And I'm sure there's billions and hundreds and thousands of African philosophies out there that is all about the harmony. It's all the same. So clean it up. Okay? Which is a developing story. Okay? You can do your own research on that. I'm doing mine. And I'm just like, from what I think will happen is they will have to clean it up, and then they will be extremely strict on companies going forward. Like, one thing about China, they ain't no stranger to making a mistake. But they gonna correct a mistake and make sure that shit never happen again. That's one thing. It sucks if you the fucking guinea pig of the shit. You know what I'm saying? But at the very least, if a fucking dam at a copper mining company broke, they gonna be and cause all this freaking riffraff, cause people to look at us sideways, they gonna be like, oh hell no. One thing we don't do is fuck with our mianzi. So mianzi is like face. Like, no, we ain't trying to look. Okay, we gotta come correct. Okay, that's all I'm asking from China, where I am right now. And that's so funny because people be thinking like, oh, there's no like freedom of speech. There's no, you can't have an opinion. You talk about the government. Oh my God, you're going to be put in the guillotine and the gulags and shit like that. I'm like, girl, if everybody's 1.4 billion people up in this country, if every person who had anything to say about the government was put in the gulag, everybody would be in the gulag. 1.4 billion people. Who would put the people in the gulag? The gulag would be putting people in the gulag. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's just too unsustainable. There's no way. You gotta have to take turns. You'd be like, okay, it's my day to be the overseer, and then you switch off. Anyone talk about the government? Okay, you can talk about the government. Okay, we're gonna put you in the gulag. Well, oh, we ain't got no more people. No more. Anyways, I don't think it's considered neo-colonialism to spread development. I've said in another video that I think China really is trying to usher in the fucking 21st century and be like, let's leave this fucking white, I said white, west, I'm gonna say west, but white, yes, white too, white supremacist, Western ideology, Christian, capitalist bullshit behind. Like, look at me, I came up, I got none of that up in here, I got no whiteness, no motherfucking, well, we got a little bit of capitalism right now, we got a little bit of capitalism, but we fucking run that shit, okay? We run that shit. And we give it to our people. We done pulled how many people out of poverty? Y'all in poverty, Latin America, Southeast Asia, Africa, Central Asia. If there's poverty, call us. Okay, we'll build you a port, an airport, power plants, infrastructure. You name it. Okay, please be nice to me in the comments because I've been drinking, and I'm just talking shit like I usually do on this account. But yeah, I think China's doing good things. Mistakes will be made. Nobody's perfect, not even a country. Nobody's perfect. To me, what matters more than anything is their response and their cleanup. Okay? And then we'll compare those outcomes to the West. It might take a couple years to really get the results of something, and we'll see how America and the EU has responded to their companies polluting and dooting and scooting.
In places like Kenya, in my home country, someone like a Bill Gates will come in and make decisions that will affect the entire nation, just like that. And we wonder, why does he have so much power? It's because Kenya is a neoliberal state. The state has been captured by corporations. who make the rules.
The conversation about whether or not China is exploiting Africa is really tied to this conversation that Khadija is having here. A lot of leftists who defend all of China's maneuvers and actions on the continent keep saying Africa can self-govern, African countries will cut deals as they see best fit for their countries. But that's the problem. These deals aren't being cut by politicians who actually care about the people that they're governing. They're being cut by kleptocrats who just happen to be in office but are otherwise stealing state resources. Those state resources go towards subsidizing a lot of the big businesses that actually own the country. This mismanagement of public funds is one of the reasons why African countries have to borrow from China in the first place. Now, if the governments are making bad deals with the Chinese government, that's on them. Unfortunately, how these bad deals play out obviously is going to harm the local population. And this is a nuance that's missing from these conversations about what China is doing. Many leftists want to ignore the reality that this fallout exists and not criticize China's involvement in the continued harm that comes to working class Africans. I'll give you an example of how this fallout happens. So the protests in Kenya that a lot of leftists were supporting were actually due to increased taxes brought forth by the finance bill that the government was trying to impose to increase taxes in order to raise more money to pay debts to China. Debts owed for massive infrastructure projects. Debts that African governments could easily clear by simply taxing wealthy elites and business owners, the same wealthy elites and business owners that Khadija just said own the country, but they're not doing that. Instead, they increase taxes on the working class that is already struggling. China is very aware of these machinations and still lends out the money. That said, it's not considered debt trap diplomacy in the way that Western powers have engaged the African continent when it comes to giving out bad loans that it knows African countries will default on in order to seize key assets. China notably does not seize assets, and it will engage in refinancing on these debts with African countries in a way that is different from how, again, Western powers have engaged with the African continent. All that said, keeping the conversation about China and Africa to, well, China is good for Africa because it's not doing imperialism, and then keeping it at that is very callous because it doesn't at all highlight the plight of the working class who will feel every single maneuver that the government has to take in order to make good on these deals. And I expect so much more from leftists who claim to have a politic of compassion and humanity. Another thing that China does that is extremely self-interested is that corners will be cut because there are no good regulations on the continent, and a lot of Chinese companies absolutely take advantage of this. That's how an entire river dies overnight in Zambia due to an acidic waste spill from Chinese-owned mines that the government is unwilling to properly regulate in case that stems the flow of investment. There are no deals that a lot of these African countries are cutting with China that are necessarily for the proletariat. That said, those deals aren't tricks from China either. African leaders are not naive. They're entering agreements with China eyes wide open and fully aware of all the trade-offs. These are not colonial impositions signed at gunpoint, but voluntary contracts negotiated by sovereign states. That's why many leftists avoid the label of neo-colonialism to describe the nature of China's deals with African states. Yet, to stop there is to miss the point completely. African governments frequently enforce these deals with violence against their own citizens when communities resist projects that, for example, require the expansion of Chinese-owned mines that encroach on indigenous land. The right of local communities to protest a mine or demand accountability is a deeper expression of African sovereignty than government contracts with China. Yet, many leftists insist that China is good for Africa actually, and just leave it there. This is where the breakdown in communication about China is happening on this app, because many leftists' allegiance to China obscures the reality of what's going on the ground when these deals are actually executed. People are seeing these deals with China cause harm that looks like colonial violence committed by Western colonizing forces. Because these deals aren't brokered under the duress of imperial violence, it is not considered a form of colonialism or neo-colonialism. But the labels don't negate the material reality. African resources are being siphoned to fund an external power, while local communities bear the brunt through pollution, displacement, and violence. Moreover, some of the infrastructure promised in exchange is poorly built or built very slowly on China's terms, sometimes not even built at all, or just far less transformative than advertised, aka the jobs that were promised aren't being generated. Therefore, leftists who focus only on the state-to-state relationship and insist that these deals are not colonialism are using textbook definitions to sidestep these material realities in an attempt to offer uncritical support to China. If advocacy is to mean anything, it must center the people on the ground, not the abstract sovereignty of governments that profit from their exploitation. True advocacy for African sovereignty is supporting local communities who don't want their land seized for infrastructure projects, be it with China or with France. The governments are corrupt, China is self-interested, and the African proletariat is just caught in the middle. So to come on here and say unabashedly China is good, stop complaining, you are missing that key aspect of it all. And that's, I think, what's causing this clash, because people are seeing the negative consequences of some of these deals, and instead of directly responding to what those negative consequences are and how they're happening, people are just saying, shut up and eat your food. Mind your business. The Africans got it. Who's got it? Because the African governments don't represent African people whatsoever. And yes, I am using general terms here, so if you're going to come in the comments and say, well, this African African country, keep it, you know what I mean. I'm using general terms to have a general conversation. So yes, that is the human first, worker first, people first complexity that I wish had featured more in this conversation about China's role in the African continent.
One of the silliest arguments I've seen in relation to this whole debate around China being neo-colonialist or imperialist in Africa is the argument of debt forgiveness. A lot of these individuals are arguing that because China has forgiven debt to some African nations, the relationship is no longer exploitative and they are actually mutually beneficial, and China is seeking to bring forward a long-term path of development that mutually benefits both African nations and China itself. But I think the argument is just completely fallacious, especially when we look at history and realize that the West has also forgiven debt to African nations several times. Exhibit A, 2005, they forgave $18 billion in debt of Nigeria. Hold on. Exhibit B, they forgave the debt of 14 African nations. 14 African nations in 2005. And if you're saying, oh, that's far in the past, just wait there. Exhibit C, they cancelled 99% of Somalia's debt just last year, 2024, right? So if we take that argument that China's debt forgiveness somehow means they are no longer imperialist and neo-colonialist towards African nations, does that now mean that the West as a whole is no longer neo-colonialist, no longer imperialist, or at least that relationship towards the African continent is no longer very exploitative because they're willing to forgive the debt of these nations here and there? Like, I feel like if you really look at it, a country forgiving debt does not mean anything in the grand scheme of things. You can still be imperialist, can still be neo-colonialist, whilst trying to ensure that the economy does not completely collapse. Issuing debt forgiveness to nations is to ensure that their economies are still able to remain viable and you're still able to invest in them more and reap more rewards from the capital you invest into them. It does not benefit China or any Western nation for these economies to completely collapse. So the argument of debt forgiveness is null and void.
The fact that China does not interfere with political issues of countries has kept China safe from so many things, The clear example that we are having right now is the decline of France. The complete dependence that they had on these African countries that they were exploiting. And now that they are becoming more autonomous is really not clicking well with them. And China being an ancient civilization, I don't think that this could be a path that they could follow. And so many African countries exercise democracy that they have no idea of. They tell us that we go and vote, but we are not the ones deciding who our leaders should be. The only people exploiting our countries are the ones who are also imposing leaders on us. Because if you can't agree with them, you're out. And China has never done that. And that's why I always stand with China, and I believe that a country can be able to rise just the way China has been able to do it. And they always say, if China can do it, so can you do it too? You can also do it without interfering, without enslaving people, without exploiting people. And what this world doesn't want to recognize is that hard work pays. And hard work is now being kind of demonized. And those who work hard are kind of looked down upon, while hard work should be a major word, a key point for us to brag about development and achievement that we are able to have. But if we can't exercise that, then we have nothing to brag about. I think this clip can explain it better. I would want to do a part 2 for this video so that I can complete the thoughts, but I really want to complete everything in this particular compilation. Just be patient, watch this clip.
You might want to retort me, but I still want to say China's rise is a peaceful one, comparatively. China is the only major power in history that became strong without conquering anyone, because to China, war is the lowest form of strategy. I'm Leah, intercultural analyst in Shanghai. As insider, I will use examples and cultural roots to tell you why China is so unique. Think about previous superpowers. When Spain and the UK rose, they built empires by colonization. When America rose, it projected power through wars. Actually, China nowadays can do that too, because you saw our military parade just the other day, right? Our military is already strong enough, but during those past 40 years, no single war is started by China. Why? Because China just doesn't want. and is smarter than you think. China's rise was totally different, built on cooperation and trade. China became the world's factory with its largest supply chains. And you've heard of Belt and Road Initiative. China built railways and ports across Asia, Africa, and Europe, linking economies through infrastructure and cooperation. And also technology, like 5G, AI, renewable energy, and now even 6G research. Why China's past is so different? Because deep in Chinese 2,000 years philosophy, power isn't about domination. Confucianism teaches ruling by virtue and harmony. We say 以和为贵. Taoism seeks softness, balance, and coexistence. We say 上善若水. And even the 2,500-year-old book, The Art of War, doesn't glorify fighting. I know the name is very misleading, right? It says the highest victory is to win without war. 不战而屈人之兵，善之善者也. You might say, oh, beautifully said. But China isn't just saying. There were many historical facts to prove it. Think about it. The Great Wall wasn't for expansion, but for protection. The Silk Road wasn't about colonization, but connecting civilizations through trade and culture. And this is also what you don't know. Actually, China set out to explore the world earlier than Columbus. In the 15th century, China launched the largest fleet in the world, the 7 voyages of Zhenghe. These ships reached Africa and the Middle East. It's decades before Columbus. But China didn't colonize as well. So what was Zhenghe there for? He's there to establish diplomacy and build trade networks. And fast forward to nowadays, we all know that history has inertia. It's like a person's childhood can greatly influence his adulthood. Today, modern China's mindset still inherits that of the past. So in the 21st century, China is still building railways, ports, and partnerships. Its rise relies more on cooperations than conquest. Besides, the harmony above all mindset has also permeated among the people. Chinese people just don't like conflicts. If you have Chinese students or co-workers by your side, you may notice Chinese people are always the least likely to argue or dispute publicly. So, if someone don't know nothing about Chinese history and culture, seeing China through a purely Western lens just doesn't work. It's like iPhone and Android. Their ecosystems are totally different. How can they be compatible? And don't tell me you understand China just because you read some media headlines. But that being said, I'm not here to impose my ideas. You can disagree, totally okay. I'm just here to communicate. I'm here to complement a perspective that's seldom heard of. And I'm not here saying, oh, China is so good, there's no bad. Come on, we're not that childish, right? I'm just saying China is smart, and it's smarter than you think. And I can't predict anything either. I'm just telling you the past. We can use the past course as a reference. Anyway, I'm Leia, intercultural analyst in Shanghai. If you want to know China through an insider's lens, you can check out my videos. Peace and love.